Putin thought Serbia was predictable, not obedient like Belarus, not hostile like Ukraine, predictable. A country that would hedge publicly, complain quietly, and ultimately stay inside Moscow's orbit when it mattered. That assumption is collapsing. And the danger isn't that Serbia suddenly turned west. The danger is far worse. Russia is losing certainty in one of the last places it believed certainty still existed. When an empire loses control of its backyard, the problem isn't territory, it's volatility. If Moscow can no longer rely on how Serbia behaves in a crisis, then escalation across Europe becomes harder to manage, harder to contain, and far more dangerous than it looks on paper. This is not about betrayal, it's about erosion. Slow, quiet, structural erosion. And Serbia is where that erosion is now impossible for the Kremlin to ignore. For decades, Serbia occupied a special position in Russian thinking. Cultural affinity, religious ties, historical memory, political usefulness. Even as NATO expanded and Russia's influence shrank elsewhere, Serbia remained the place Moscow believed it could still operate without friction. A space where pressure didn't need to be applied aggressively because loyalty would do the work. That belief shaped how Russia approached the entire Western Balkans. Now it's cracking, and once that belief goes, everything built on it becomes unstable. The Kremlin does not fear Serbia as a military threat. It fears Serbia as an unpredictable variable, because unpredictability is poison to a strategy built on pressure, delay, and controlled escalation. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how Russia defines influence. Moscow does not need formal alliances everywhere. It needs environments that behave the way it expects. Serbia was one of those environments. Public opinion leaned pro-Russian. Energy ties reinforced dependence. Political rhetoric allowed Moscow to present Serbia as proof that Russia still had friends in Europe. That mattered enormously after 2014. It mattered even more after 2022. As Europe hardened against Moscow following the invasion of Ukraine, Serbia stood out as the exception. No sanctions, careful language, a posture of neutrality that, from Moscow's perspective, bordered on quiet support. But neutrality only works for Russia when it is stable, and Serbia is no longer stable in the way Moscow needs. Cultural sympathy still exists. Historical memory hasn't disappeared, but culture does not equal control. What Russia is discovering is that familiarity does not guarantee alignment once strategic costs rise. Belgrade understands this too. Serbia's leadership has spent years walking a narrowing tightrope between Russia and the European Union, NATO neighbors, global markets, and economic reality. That rope is tightening. Standing still is no longer viable, and when standing still stops being an option, drift begins. From Moscow's perspective, the most dangerous shift isn't rhetorical, it's behavioral. Serbia no longer behaves like a country whose foreign policy can be quietly predicted. It still speaks the language of balance. It still avoids dramatic breaks, but its actions increasingly diverge from Russian expectations. Votes that don't align the way Moscow assumed. Diplomatic positioning that creates distance without confrontation. Quiet alignment with Western frameworks that doesn't trigger headlines, but changes direction. This is the worst possible scenario for the Kremlin. Russia's influence model relies on clarity. Clear friends, clear pressure points, clear escalation ladders. Serbia is becoming none of those. It is not hostile. It is not loyal. It is not safely neutral. It is adaptive. Adaptive actors are extremely difficult to control. Russia can intimidate isolated states. It can pressure dependent ones. It can punish defiant ones. What it struggles with is a country that absorbs pressure, delays decisions, and integrates quietly elsewhere without triggering a clean response. That kind of drift doesn't invite retaliation. It creates anxiety because Moscow can't respond without escalating the very problem it wants to contain. For years, energy was Russia's strongest lever over Serbia. Gas meant leverage. Leverage meant influence. Influence meant predictability. But dependency only works when alternatives don't exist. That condition is eroding. European diversification, regional interconnectors, and long-term supply planning have reduced the cost of defiance. Not eliminated it, reduced it. That distinction matters. Serbia didn't flip a switch. It gained margin, and margin changes behavior. Belgrade no longer has to fear that every deviation from Moscow's expectations will trigger immediate economic punishment. That freedom weakens Russian influence far more than loud declarations ever could. Influence built on dependency collapses fast once dependency loosens. Russia understands this, which is why losing energy leverage hurts Moscow strategically, not just economically. Another assumption Russia relied on was internal coherence, a society broadly sympathetic to Moscow, a political environment where pro-Russian narratives landed easily, a domestic landscape the Kremlin believed it understood. That environment is fragmenting. Serbia has faced growing internal pressure over governance, corruption, environmental issues, and economic direction. None of this is inherently anti-Russian, but fragmentation changes how influence works. In divided societies, external control becomes harder. Narratives compete. Loyalty stops being automatic. Influence becomes contested. Russia's influence in Serbia was never enforced by force. It was maintained through familiarity and expectation. Those tools are far less effective in a polarized environment. And unlike hard power, Russia has little ability to stabilize someone else's internal politics without triggering backlash. The more Serbia debates its future openly, the less reliable it becomes as an anchor for Russian influence in the Balkans. There's another layer Moscow did not fully anticipate. Russia is no longer Serbia's only alternative to the West. China has entered Serbia economically and infrastructurally in ways that dilute Russian leverage. Beijing doesn't need ideological alignment. It needs access, contracts, and positioning. That creates a competitive influence environment Moscow struggles to dominate. When Russia was the primary alternative, its leverage was strong. When Russia becomes one of several options, leverage thins. Putin does not fear China globally. He fears competition in places he assumed were secure. Serbia is becoming one of those places, and once influence becomes competitive, control evaporates quietly. For Moscow, Serbia was never just Serbia. It was an anchor, a reference point that allowed Russia to manage the Western Balkans without dominating them directly. As long as Serbia stayed predictable, Russia could assume pressure in the region would move slowly. Alignments would remain blurred. Escalation could be delayed, negotiated, compartmentalized. That anchor is slipping, and when an anchor loosens, everything tied to it begins to drift. Russia's influence in the Balkans has always worked best when it stayed quiet, not through permanent deployments or open confrontation, but through signaling and expectation. The assumption that Moscow still mattered when security decisions were made. Serbia made that assumption credible, because Serbia sits at the center of the region's gravity. Its posture affects Bosnia, Kosovo, Montenegro, and North Macedonia, whether those governments admit it or not. As long as Serbia was reliable, Russia could shape outcomes indirectly. That model is now breaking. Serbia's unpredictability forces Moscow to treat the Balkans not as a manageable buffer, but as contested space. Influence must be actively maintained instead of assumed. That's expensive, and Russia is already overstretched. As long as Serbia was reliable, Russia could shape outcomes indirectly. That model is now breaking. Serbia's unpredictability forces Moscow to treat the Balkans not as a manageable buffer, but as contested space. Influence must be actively maintained instead of assumed. That is expensive, and Russia is already overstretched. The obvious question is why Russia doesn't simply apply pressure. The problem is that Serbia is the wrong kind of target. It is not isolated. It is not economically expendable. It is not diplomatically invisible. Any overt pressure on Serbia immediately draws European attention, hardens Western involvement, and accelerates exactly the drift Russia wants to stop. This is the paradox Putin now faces. Energy pressure pushes Serbia faster toward diversification. Political pressure pushes Belgrade closer to Brussels. Security pressure internationalizes the issue immediately. Unlike earlier cases, there is no ambiguity Russia can safely exploit. Serbia sits inside Europe's security architecture, surrounded by NATO states, EU institutions, and integrated markets. Destabilization does not stay local. Putin understands this, which is why Russia's response has been hesitant, reactive, and cautious. That caution is not strength, it is constraint. One of the Kremlin's most uncomfortable realities is that Serbia's future is decided less by sentiment than by economics. The European Union remains Serbia's largest trading partner, investor, and growth horizon. Cultural affinity does not replace markets, jobs, or financial stability. This creates a structural disadvantage for Russia. Influence based on identity struggles against influence based on prosperity. Russia cannot replace Europe economically. It cannot anchor Serbia's growth. It cannot offer a comparable development path. Putin can offer rhetoric and diplomatic cover. He cannot offer scale. This traps Moscow. It cannot match the EU. It cannot coerce Serbia without backlash. And it cannot ignore the drift without losing credibility elsewhere. So the drift continues, quietly, persistently, irreversibly. There's a dangerous assumption that losing influence makes states cautious. History shows the opposite. When certainty disappears, leaders overcorrect. They hedge aggressively. They push in the wrong places. They mistake hesitation for opportunity. Russia's strategy depends on knowing how actors will behave during crises. Serbia used to be predictable enough to plan around. That certainty is gone. Now Moscow must plan for multiple outcomes simultaneously. Cooperation, delay, abstention, quiet alignment elsewhere. That forces hedging, more contingency planning, more attention, more resources managing what used to be automatic. This is how Overstretch begins, not with defeat, with distraction. Other states are watching this closely, not just in the Balkans, but across Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, regions where Russia's influence has never been absolute, but was long assumed to be durable. Governments there are not asking whether Serbia is switching sides. They're asking something more practical. Can Moscow still rely on loyalty without force? Serbia matters because it has everything Russia typically counts on: cultural ties, historical sympathy, a public narrative that has leaned friendly for decades. If influence can fray even there quietly without open confrontation, then it suggests Russia's grip is more conditional than it appears. That perception reshapes behavior. States that once hesitated begin to hedge. Leaders who avoided friction start testing boundaries more carefully. Decisions that used to be delayed become possible simply because the cost of defiance looks lower than it did before. Influence does not disappear overnight. It thins, and once thinning becomes visible, it accelerates. Deterrence is not only about capability, it is about expectation. When actors stop assuming Moscow's response will be decisive or predictable, they begin acting with more independence. That independence compounds across regions, stretching attention and weakening coherence. This is how influence systems unravel, not through a single break, but through many small recalculations made by others who are watching and learning in real time. And Serbia is one of the clearest signals yet that those recalculations are already underway. Timing is what turns this from a slow drift into a serious risk. By 2026, Russia is no longer operating with strategic cushion. The war in Ukraine has hardened into a long-term condition rather than a temporary crisis. Resources are not just strained, they are allocated. Attention is not flexible, it is locked. Political capital is spent managing endurance rather than enabling expansion. That matters because influence requires surplus. It works best when pressure can be applied casually, when uncertainty elsewhere can be absorbed without consequence. Russia no longer has that luxury. Every new complication now draws from a finite pool of attention, credibility, and control. Serbia used to sit outside that equation. It was a background constant, not an active variable, something Moscow could rely on without revisiting. By 2026, it becomes something that has to be watched, modeled, and managed. And management is expensive. Each uncertain alignment forces contingency planning. Each contingency forces prioritization. And prioritization forces exposure because choosing where to focus reveals where you cannot. This is where timing becomes lethal. Russia is not facing one decisive threat. It is facing accumulated strain. When influence frays at the edges while pressure mounts at the center, leaders lose the ability to sequence decisions cleanly. Everything starts demanding attention at once. That compresses timelines. Compressed timelines reward risk-taking. They encourage moves designed to restore momentum quickly rather than stability slowly. Not because they are optimal, but because delay feels like loss. By 2026, Russia is operating in exactly that environment. Not weak, but overextended. Not defeated, but constrained. Not collapsing, but increasingly forced to choose between bad options. And when great powers are forced into trade-offs instead of choices, they don't fail quietly. They stumble. That is why this moment matters. Not because Serbia changed, but because the system trying to manage Serbia has less room for error than it did before. And systems with no slack are the ones that break when timing goes wrong. The most dangerous outcome is not Serbia choosing the West. That would be clear, manageable, predictable. The real danger is Serbia remaining ambiguous while Moscow grows increasingly unsure of how that ambiguity will resolve. Ambiguity forces guessing. Guessing forces contingency. And contingency is where miscalculation thrives. When influence fades slowly, it doesn't announce itself. It creates gaps in expectation. Old assumptions stop working, but nothing replaces them cleanly. Leaders begin reacting not to reality, but to what they fear might be coming next. This is where pressure strategies become brittle. And when pressure strategies become brittle, the risk isn't escalation by design, it's escalation by mistake.